All right, guys. Y'all take your Bibles, turn to 2 Corinthians. Something or another. 2 Corinthians 1. We are just moving along at warp speed at this point. All the way to verse 23 in 2 Corinthians chapter 1. And the mission trip report, I've seen some pictures from that trip. And have you ever seen pictures where underneath it the comment is why women live longer than men? Have you ever seen that kind of thing? You know, and usually ladders or moving couches or things like that are involved. You know, like guys are going to catch a couch sort of thing. There might be some of that in those pictures, but that's just me. But yeah, we're gonna have time where we can have a nice full report from those guys. So 2 Corinthians chapter 1. I really kind of went back and forth on how many verses to cover tonight, and then remembered it was business meeting, and didn't know if we'd get to any of them at all. So I sort of chopped it in half because really various commentators and people who divide up stuff do it differently. And so I decided to go with the shorter version. And so let me read to you 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 23 through chapter 2 and verse 4. And that's what we'll look at tonight. It says, Paul writes, "But I call God as witness to my soul that to spare you I did not come again to Corinth. Not that we lord it over your faith, but are workers with you for your joy, for in your faith you are standing firm. But I determined this for my own sake, that I would not come to you in sorrow again. For if I cause you sorrow, who then makes me glad but the one who I made sorrowful? This is the very thing I wrote you, so that when I came, I would not have sorrow from those who ought to make me rejoice, having confidence in you that all my joy would be the joy of you all. For out of much affliction and anguish of heart I wrote to you with many tears, so that you would be, not so you would be made sorrowful, but that you might know the love which I have especially for you." As we've been talking about every week, Paul had a really contemptuous at times relationship with this church. The church at Corinth was not a good church to be a part of. They had all kinds of sin within the church. They had all kinds of disobedience. They abused the Lord's Supper. They abused spiritual gifts. There was immorality within the church. It was bad. And that's one of the reasons Paul probably wrote 4 letters, as I've mentioned. God preserved 2. But he probably wrote 4, and one of those is the letter he seems to be referring to in this section, a severe letter, one with sorrow, one with tears, one that he wanted to write so that he didn't have to have those conversations in person. And here, it really all comes down to this. Paul loved this church, as messed up as they were, and as backwards as they had things, and as awkward as they had cliques and all. It was just bad. This was like this was his baby. He was the father of many churches. He planted many churches, but this was the child that he had to spend the most time on and try to help them mature and try to help them be successful. And you just hear the love coming through the letter as he's writing this paragraph to them, trying to explain something. And what he's trying to explain is he had planned to make a trip to them at one point, and then he didn't. And some of the people who were opposed to Paul used that, the fact that he said, "I'm coming," and then he didn't come. They used that as like ammunition against him to say, see, he's not a man of his word, he's not an apostle, he's not doing God's will. So they were using it. So part of 2 Corinthians is him explaining why he didn't come in the first place. And this paragraph is part of that. And notice what he does in verse 23. He says, "But I call God as my witness to my soul that to spare you I did not come again to Corinth." He's using the language of the court of the day. And he's calling our courts too. He's calling God as a witness. He's appealing, and he's already talked about God's nature in the previous paragraph when it comes to Paul's own integrity. That's what he talks about in verses 15 through 22. So he's still talking about that, right? So he's basically telling them, if you could ask the Lord, if you could look at the Father, if you could look at the Son and say, is Paul genuine in what he's telling us? Is Paul a man of integrity? Does he really love us? Is he actually an apostle? He would say, the Lord would say, yes, he is. That's how confident Paul is in his calling, in his relationship to the Lord. And out of that comes his relationship with the church at Corinth, because who is it that called Paul to do what he did, to be the church planter, to be the missionary? It was God himself. On the road to Damascus, I mean, obviously God always calls people, but I just read it this morning or yesterday. Well, the mornings run together. But you know, when he encounters the risen Christ, and he tells Ananias, I want you to go and pray for this man who's blind. I have a plan for him, and he's going to take the gospel. So Paul is saying, look, if you could just talk to the Lord, you would know my heart. You would know that I'm a man of integrity, and I'm someone who cares about you. Verse 24, he says, not that we lord it over your faith, but are workers with you for your joy, for in your faith you are standing firm. Now here's why he says this. Paul has a role in the church. And by church, I mean the church as a whole, not just the church at Corinth. Paul has a role that no longer exists, and that is one of an apostle, big A. apostle. Sometimes we still refer to people, use that term, like if you're in our spiritual gifts class on Sunday night, we talk about the gift of apostleship, of being sent out. That's the idea of, like a church planter, missionary kind of thing. But that official office of apostle, that first generation of Christians, those people that saw the risen Christ, right? That's why Jesus himself appeared to Paul on the road to Damascus, because Paul was then qualified to be an apostle in the same sense that Peter and James and John and Matthew and all those, all the 12, he was just as qualified, and he had the exact same authority. There's nobody on the planet Earth that has the kind of authority those guys had. When they went off the scene, that went away. That's why the New Testament, for instance, is only at most separated by one person from an apostle. Think about it. Matthew encountered the risen Christ. He walked with Jesus. He was there. Wrote Matthew's gospel. Mark, just one generation removed, one of the early followers. He was around the apostles. Luke, same thing. That first generation, he was around the apostles. John, one of the apostles. Acts, you're back to Luke. He was around them. Paul, actually an apostle. He saw the risen Christ. We don't know who wrote Hebrews, but the church has always accepted that this has the same authority as the rest of us. Whoever it was either an apostle or was around them. James, brother of Jesus, saw the resurrected Christ. Peter, an apostle. Jude, brother of Jesus. So the whole New Testament is either written by somebody with the authority that Paul has, or someone who was brought up under them. Once you get past that generation, there's no more Scripture. So those guys, and one of the reasons is those guys have passed off the scene. That sense of authority is no longer around. That specific office has played its role, because now the Scriptures have been completed. The gospel is starting to go to the corners of the earth. I say all that to let you understand what Paul is telling them in verse 24. He says, not that we lord it over your faith. Here's what he's telling them. Look, guys, I'm an apostle, and if I wanted to, I could just call down with authority and say, thus saith the Lord, and this is what you have to do. But that's not what he's wanting to do. He's wanting to work together. He's wanting to be a family. He's wanting to be a unit. He's wanting to be unified, because he says, but are workers with you for your joy. See the humility there? So here's a guy that has a spiritual authority that only a handful of people on the planet have ever had. He can speak for the Lord, right? He can cast out, he can do all the stuff. But he says to this church, but I'm just like you. We're all workers together. I don't want to lord this over you. In fact, this word for lording it over, Jesus used it to talk about the Gentiles. In Luke 22, It says, and there arose also a dispute among them as to which of them was regarded to be the greatest. He, that is Jesus, said to them, the kings of the Gentiles lord it over them, and those who have authority over them are called benefactors. But it is not this way with you, but the one who is the greatest among you must become like the youngest, and the leader like the servant. Right? That's how God set up the I can't come up with a better word than economy, but the economy of church leadership and how the church functions. It's about serving. It's about putting others first. It's about humbling yourself. So Paul, having the authority of an apostle, is writing to people that he loves, and he's saying, we're in this together. I know you're disappointed, but there's a reason I didn't come, and it's because I love you. And if I wanted to, I could lord things over you because I'm an apostle. I could do that, but I don't want to do that because we're in this thing together. So in chapter 2 and verse 1, he explains it further. He says, but I determined this for my own sake, that I would not come to you in sorrow again. Here's what he says. He put it in family terms. Here's what he's saying. Guys, I didn't want to fight anymore because I hate fighting with you because it doesn't get us anywhere. And it hurts our relationship. And I didn't want to do it. And that's basically where he is. He's saying, I love you. I didn't want to bring you sorrow again. You've had enough of that. We've dealt with things. I had to write the letter, but now we can move forward. Because verse 2, he says, for if I cause you sorrow, so if you guys are sad, who then makes me glad but the one who I made sorrowful? He's saying, how am I going to be encouraged if I've discouraged you? Because if I've discouraged you and I show up, you're going to be mad at me. And then it's just a circle. It's just a cycle here going on. This 2 Corinthians is probably the most personal letter that Paul wrote. I mean, he's really pouring his heart out to these people. He loves them, and they've had major problems. And he is explaining to them why he loves them, why he cares about them, and how they're connected. Verse 3, he says, this is the very thing I wrote to you. So he's talking to that letter. So that when I came, I would not have sorrow from those who ought to make me rejoice. In other words, he wanted to take care of that stuff before he was able to come to them. Having confidence in you all that my joy would be the joy of you all. It's interesting, the positive outlook here, because he's had a really tough time with his church. They've had bad times together. They haven't responded well to his leadership. It's just been ugly at times. And yet, he has the confidence here to say, look, I know if we do this right, when we get together, we're going to get along. And there's going to be joy, and there's going to be rejoicing. That's something that you and I always have to keep in mind. If you've ever been in a situation of like real palpable church conflict, right? I hope you haven't, but if you have, it's difficult to even come to church. It's difficult to worship. It's always in the back of everybody's mind, the thing that's going on. But it's Sunday morning, so you got to come together for church, even though everybody's fighting and everybody's acting ugly and all that. But it's 11 o'clock, so it's time for church. That is an awful place to be. If you've ever been in the midst of that, it's just ugly, and it drains everything from you, spiritually speaking. Paul's been through that kind of stuff with this church, but he still has the confidence that they can get beyond all that and get it resolved and be family and rejoice together and have joy and serve the Lord. Verse 4, he says, for out of much affliction and anguish of heart. Do you hear? I mean, he's just laying himself bare here. I wrote to you with many tears. So he's weeping as he writes to them because he loves them, and yet they have all these things he's got to take care of. Not so that you would be made sorrowful, but that you might know the love which I have especially for you. This goes back to what you may have said to your kids before you spank them. This is going to hurt me worse than it hurts you, kind of thing, right? They never believe you, by the way. Y'all know that. They're like, whatever, Dad. But that's really what he's saying here. He loves these people, and he doesn't want to have to be harsh. He doesn't want to have to be confrontational. He doesn't want to go through that. It has to happen. He's going to talk about it, and this is one of the reasons some people combine these verses with 5 through 11, because he's going to talk about that there was someone in the church that they needed to deal with. They need to deal with like discipline-wise. It may be the one that he talks about in 1 Corinthians that was involved in an immoral relationship, but he doesn't actually come right out and say it, so that's just kind of guesswork. So he's going to refer to that in the next paragraph. So there was some stuff that had to be confronted. There's some stuff that had to be dealt with, and you can't ignore those things because they just fester and tear a church apart and tear relationships apart. You have to deal with the stuff, but it should grieve you. It should be sorrowful. It should be difficult to deal with the stuff. You should never think, oh boy, we get to practice church discipline. Aren't y'all excited? I mean, that's the opposite. Although I think there are some churches who have taken it that way. I think there are some guys who have to answer for that kind of attitude. They just seem to be real excited about, bringing church discipline down on somebody. But if you don't deal with what's going on in the church, and you're in leadership, you're not actually loving the people in the church, right? If you don't, back to the raising kids, right, to having a family, if you don't correct your kids, right, they're going to stick, there's the light socket, they've got the fork in their hand, here they go, right? What are you going to do? Well, I don't want to yell at my kids. I don't want to make them feel bad. Well, they're flying across the room because they just stuck the fork in the socket, right? The loving thing to do is to stop them, whatever is most appropriate at the time. Whether you got to tackle them, scream at them, whatever it is. My dad had a particular sound that I won't make because I have the mic on, just because it would blow it out. But anyway, that whatever that was, that my girls even responded to that. When my dad would do it, they'd be like, what is that? It's not the sound I made. Anyway, it's interesting how we're all raised differently, but that is a loving act. Discipline is a loving act, and it needs to be done in love. And that's what he's trying to get them to understand, is he loves them. He didn't come to them for a lot of different reasons, and one of them is he just didn't want to fight anymore. The letter dealt with the stuff that needed to be dealt with. They're dealing with it based on that letter. It was a harsh letter, and now when he comes, they can worship together. That's what he wants to happen. And so we'll see how all that plays out as the book continues. But this is just him just laying it out there and saying, guys, this is tough, but I love you, and we're going to deal with it that way. So here's what I wrote for this particular paragraph. The foundation for relationships within the church is godly love. Notice I said godly love. And godly love is sacrificial love. It's putting others first. In 1 Timothy, Paul wrote, "But the goal of our instruction is love from a pure heart and a good conscience and a sincere faith." If you and I genuinely care about one another, I'm not talking about surfacey Sunday morning, how you doing, I'm wonderful, so good to see you kind of stuff. I'm talking about actually care about one another. Then if we're straying in our faith, we're going to say something. If we're hurting, we're going to bring comfort. We're going to be there. All the surfacey stuff looks nice on Sunday morning, before church, but if there's no actual genuine love, then we're just going through the motions. Paul here is telling them, I'm not going through the motions here. I love you guys. I'm not hammering my apostolic authority on top of your head. We're in this thing together. And that's the love we're to show for one another. I go back around to thinking about church conflict. Most church conflict, and just about any conflict, whether it's marriage or, you're within family or whatever, almost all conflict, if you narrow down far enough and you work your way down far enough, it's almost always with selfishness at its root. It's my way. I want what I want. Think about fights in your marriage, especially early in your marriage. Hopefully you worked all this out in the first few years, but when you're trying to figure out how your relationship works and, you've got the way you were raised and your spouse has the way they were raised, and so you're fighting about which way do the forks point in the drawer, stuff that does not matter at all. In the long run, you look back and you think, that was stupid. Why was that even a thing? But it's typically selfishness is at the root of it, because Selfishness is our default mode. Because what is selfishness? Selfishness is just good old-fashioned paganism. Because selfishness is worship of self. It's worshiping something other than God. That's just paganism, because what did pagans do? They created gods in whose image? In their own. In the image of man. It's not man created the image of God. They created God in the image of man. You go back and read about the Greek and the Roman gods and the Norse gods and all that. They're terribly sinful because they're created in man's image. They're self-centered. They're hateful, and they're untrustworthy. That is if it's not for the changing that comes about because of the gospel, that's where we all default. And even saved people, if we get in the flesh, we're going to go right back to it. And that's where all things like church conflict and marriage conflict and all that stuff comes from. That's why Paul is saying we're in this together. So let's work this thing out. So, well, guys, that's 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 23 through chapter 2 and verse 4. Those of you on Facebook or YouTube tomorrow, for you YouTubers, this doesn't matter. You won't see this till Thursday. The delay doesn't affect you. But for your Facebook guys, thank you all for being patient as we had business meeting, the most Baptist night of the quarter, and so appreciate y'all's patience in that. But we're going to log off now and have a few minutes to go over our prayer sheet. But thank you guys for being here.